We're all familiar with Tarkov's weapon stats, but they don't really do a great job of telling you what a gun is actually good at. There is very little in-game explanation for what some of these numbers even mean. Sure, if you've played enough, you can start to get a feel for what weapons are the best for different situations and potentially overall, but that's all it really is, a feel. So with my very average and slightly rusty spreadsheet skills and ChatGPT trying its best to freshen up my 5th grade math, I wanted to try to expand upon the weapon stats in Tarkov to get a more useful idea of a weapon's real strengths and weaknesses in practical gameplay relevant situations. So I set out to create some new stats based on the information we have available from the game itself, and also stats from various community tools that way smarter people than me have created. From these stats, we're going to try to measure the statistically and mathematically, if you want, best weapons in Tarkov in different categories. And we're starting with the automatic rifles for this video. Now we're going to start with recoil, controllability, and hit consistency. Hit consistency is a very interesting stat in this category. Then we're going to go into ergo, Evo Ergo, and handling. Next is DPS, raw, and also through armor. And then we're going to look at some time to kill stats based on actual ballistics and not just DPS. Then we're going to have a look at the various weapons' performance at different ranges and also their general accuracy evaluations. And then we'll end by giving the weapons some overall scores based on their performance in select categories and reflect on them as overall choices. We're going to go through the categories one by one as well, because if it's not obvious, it's very hard to give a proper overall score. Tarkov is an extremely situational game with a lot of depth and variety in each firefight compared to a lot of other games. So therefore, we'll explore each of the categories to find the best one for each, as well as trying to find the overall best to whatever degree that's possible, because arguably, a overall best doesn't really exist. Now, to some people, it's not going to be a major surprise what weapons are going to be on top, but I still think there is a lot of interesting comparisons in this video, and it gives us a lot of perspective on the relative power of the weapons, exactly how much better or how much worse some weapons are than others, and how surprisingly close some are to each other. The stats are based off of a meta build for each version, both loud and suppressed where relevant, so a Val is only suppressed, for example, and I've tried to balance ergo and recoil, so as low recoil as possible without sacrificing too much ergo. Sometimes this means that if I've had ergo to spare to go for a longer barrel, I have, like with the X17 compared to the Scar Age. All the guns have 30 rounders base or 20 rounders for the 308s. They have an EOTech holographic, which means LPVOs would drop the ergo a couple more points usually. They also all have a WMX 200 flashlight. This is a -2 ergo flashlight and pretty much covers the ergo penalty from any tactical devices. Now, obviously, people build their guns differently and have different preferences for ergo and recoil prio. Some people prio recoil to the point of overswing for some weapons. So, pinch of salt here, obviously, you could very well squeeze out some more ergo or recoil for these builds, but this is just how I would prioritize between the two. So instead of just trying to get the weapons to some theoretical absolute meta, I have instead focused on them being meta, but built with the consistently same preference, namely mine, obviously, in this case. Let's start simple by taking a look at how a weapon feels to control during recoil. This is something I would call controllability, and I've split this into a few different stats. Now, these stats are meant to give a very straightforward value for recoil, but also to highlight how recoil works, and also for being used in some of the other more interesting stats that we'll get to a little bit later. First, let's look at the initial recoil during a short burst. This is initial burst controllability. Now, this is derived from a weapon's recoil stats as well as its fire rate, and it places more importance on vertical recoil since that's what you're fighting most directly in that first part of a spray. It also gives a mild exponent to try and reflect that going from 20 to 30 recoil is a smaller change than going from 50 to 60 in terms of feel. And with higher amounts of per shot recoil, you will experience a lot more room for human error in trying to execute spray control, as the amount of counteractive movement the player has to make with their mouse is bigger, especially when dealing with high recoil when compensating for spray at longer distances. Fire rate will also affect this, as obviously it entails more recoil to control in a shorter amount of time. This scales very softly though, as not to overly punish high RPM weapons, because that isn't really fair, as fire rate is something you can fairly easily adjust to, as it is a very predictable factor, because 800 RPM is always going to be 800 RPM. IBC also includes a small penalty for recoil angle deviation, so weapons that don't pull straight up, i.e. 90 degrees, get slightly docked. Most weapons in Tarkov have recoil that travels straight up at 90 degrees, but some tilt slightly. For example, the AKM series of rifles will pull a bit to the right at 85 degrees, while the 5.56 AKs, like the AK-101, will pull more to the left at 100 degrees. But overall, these angles don't deviate more than 10 degrees. Now, when looking at the IBC results, we can see the SCAR-L is the winner here, both loud and suppressed. It has a very low per-shot recoil as well as a low fire rate. The AK-101 and 102 performs very well as well, very much for the same reason as the SCAR, along with the M4, the 5.56 MDR, and the SR3M. Now, I'm not going to dwell on these results too much, they are fairly obvious and straightforward. I instead want to prioritize getting to the more interesting results, so pause the video if you want to take a further look. I also wanted to see the ratio between vertical and horizontal recoil. This is simply done by dividing vertical recoil by horizontal recoil. And I decided to call this stat predictability, because if a weapon has good predictability, it means that it has a low amount of horizontal recoil compared to its vertical. This means its average spray pattern will in effect be narrower and taller rather than short and wide, and therefore it will be determined more by the predictable vertical recoil than the unpredictable horizontal recoil, because what really introduces the randomness in recoil is the horizontal recoil, because in Tarkov, guns don't follow a consistent spray pattern. Instead, each shot randomly kicks left or right from the weapon's recoil line. To show how this works, I've put a visualization on screen. So think of the recoil angle, usually 90 degrees, as the weapon's natural spray direction. Horizontal recoil then adds deviation to that line, randomly left or right, and the higher your horizontal recoil, the wider that spread can be. This makes horizontal recoil the unpredictable one of the two recoil stats. And it's quite interesting, as we can see there is a very intentional relationship between the two, possibly to try and balance the weapons using this relationship, where low recoil weapons have a disproportionately higher horizontal recoil, and this is adding quite a bit more randomness or unpredictability to the low recoil weapons. This is probably done to try and compensate for them being so easy to control vertically. And the bigger caliber, higher recoil weapons will have a smaller amount of horizontal recoil relative to the vertical, to make up for their much higher vertical recoil. This is also very evident with the low vertical recoil SMGs, which will have a very high amount of horizontal recoil, which we'll see when we get to the SMGs video, but it's interesting to know nonetheless. It's also important to keep in mind here that even though the relative relationship is better for some of these higher caliber weapons, they still just have way more recoil, both vertical and horizontal, and are therefore going to be harder to control in general. Then there is CFC, or continuous fire controllability. Now this measures how much recoil builds up per second, giving us a general sense of how hard a weapon is to manage during sustained fire. We already have IBC that covers the initial burst, so this is aimed more at measuring the recoil after the weapon has stabilized. Because in Tarkov, as you might know, vertical recoil will stabilize after the first 6-7 or so bullets of a spray. Since this is aimed at the spray after the initial burst is over, horizontal recoil is a bigger factor than vertical. So since vertical recoil is consistent and learnable and also stabilized during prolonged fire, but horizontal is unpredictable and reactive, we've weighed horizontal recoil twice as much as vertical in the CFC formula. This recoil sum has also been given a mild exponent, again to account for the increased amount of compensation needed, and the room for error also increasing. Now, when looking at the CFC results, we can see that the AK-101 and AK-102 are the best. The X17 is also remarkably high on this list. The Scar Age and X17, both loud and suppressed, are gapping every other 308 weapon, likely thanks to fire rate and their low recoil. The SA-58, while having the best predictability score of all the automatic rifles, it's scoring amongst the worst in CFC, likely due to just having so much recoil. The RD-704 is doing very well in this category, partly due to its 600 RPM fire rate, but also due to it having a high predictability and a low horizontal recoil, barely higher than some of the 5.56 weapons at the top. The SCAR-L drops down despite its top spot in IBC. This is mainly due to it having worse horizontal recoil than these similar weapons. The SR3M, while being one of the best short burst weapons with an IBC score at the 94th percentile, it struggles in continued fire due to high horizontal recoil. It actually has the worst predictability score of all the automatic rifles besides the AVT, and it also has a very high fire rate. As CFC is recoil per second, it does scale with fire rate, meaning higher fire rate weapons will score worse, and the 800 RPM M4 gets put back quite a bit as a result of this, as it's going to be harder to skillfully control during continued fire. Looking at pure horizontal recoil, the M4 and the AK-101, both suppressed, are the clear winners at 140 and 141 respectively, but even the low 140 horizontal recoil of the M4 doesn't make up for it having a higher fire rate. So the AKs are the clear winners in this category. Now let's get to the interesting stuff, because I made what I think is probably the best way to numerically show how consistent a weapon feels. This is called hit consistency, and it's a measure of the relationship between high fire rate and low recoil, meaning the more controllable a weapon is compared to its fire rate, the better it will perform in this stat. And this rewards high fire rate and low recoil weapons, because if you can put a lot of rounds down range at a target with low recoil, you are more likely to land shots on that target. And while initial burst controllability and continuous fire controllability is very representative in terms of measuring pure recoil, I don't think they necessarily reflect how the weapons feel in terms of landing shots. This is also a really good way to see what weapons are going to be good at hitting headshots. And going for headshots is very much the current meta in Tarkov due to how weak most helmets are and how unsustainable and rare good helmets are. Because when going for headshots, you want a minimum of 40 plus pen ammo being shot from a low recoil gun with a high fire rate, because that gives you a very consistent stream of bullets wherever you are aiming, which is going to help you land headshots. Now, when looking at the hit consistency results, we can see that the 9x39s dominate this category, quite obviously, as this is based on the two things those weapons are known and used for, which is low recoil and high fire rate. The M4 does sneak in there and prevents the top three from being all 9x39s, squeezing in front of the VSS for third place. The HK and G36 also does very well here. The HK, while struggling a little bit in terms of recoil, it is the highest fire rate 5.56 gun at 850 RPM, which is securing it a good placement here. The SIG Spear also does quite well, specifically the suppressed one, and there is a gap down to the Loud Spear as it suffers from not really having any decent muzzle devices, and as a result you can't really fix its recoil problem. The AK-101 is also fairly solid here, even though it's just got 650 RPM. It has a similar recoil to the 9x39s and the M4, which is what's keeping it up there. The surprising one in this category is really the Velociraptor, being almost at the bottom of the list, only beating the Ash 12, the AVT, and the suppressed 308 MDR. I think this kind of explains why no one really likes that gun very much, even though it isn't all that bad on paper, it just doesn't feel very consistent and good to shoot. Just please give us at the very least a fucking foregrip option for that gun, and that would help a lot, just that. The higher calibers, like 7.62 and 308, being shot from slow-firing weapons, are generally speaking the worst performers in this category, to no real surprise. 9x39 and 5.56 are absolutely dominating the top 10, with the Spear at 10th place being the highest of any other caliber. 5.45 is generally beaten out on fire rate here, which is also coincidentally the main drawback of the 5.45 AKs in general. Another very central aspect of gunplay in Tarkov is how quickly and comfortably you can get your weapon on target and keep it there. The ability to snap to target and stay in control during those first few shots is often what will decide a firefight. So to describe a weapon's ability in this kind of a scenario, we'll combine two existing stats into a stat which we will call handling. The two stats are initial burst controllability, which we looked at earlier, which measures how much recoil a weapon generates in the initial burst, and also something called Evo Ergo, which is a better form of ergonomics, which reflects things like ADS time and how fast and fluid the weapon actually feels to use. Together, they reward weapons that are both stable to fire and snappy to use. Before we get to handling though, let's take a look at Evo Ergo, because Evo Ergo, or Evolved Ergonomics, isn't an official in-game stat. The credit for it goes to a website called DB for Tarkov and its creator. The standard ergonomics value in Tarkov can be very misleading because it doesn't account for the weapon's weight, which has a hidden but very significant penalty on a weapon's ergonomics. Ergonomics improves your ADS speed, reduces aim sway, slows stamina drain while aiming, and reduces the noise from aiming down sights. But the heavier your weapon is, the more those benefits are negated. And since the weight's penalty on ergonomics is not visible anywhere in game, two guns with the same ergo value can have very different ADS times, for example, if one is significantly heavier. Evo Ergo solves this by calculating a better ergonomics value, which is your effective or real ergonomics after factoring in the weight of the weapon, including attachments. And yes, the weight of attachments also matters, and heavy attachments like suppressors will often incur a way bigger Evo Ergo penalty or real ergonomics penalty than what the in-game ergonomics stats will tell you. Also, things like bullets will matter here, so a 30-rounder that's full of heavy bullets will affect Evo Ergo substantially more than an empty 30-rounder. This means you suffer a bigger ergo penalty than what the tooltip for a 30-rounder tells you, which also means that 60-rounders, which are effectively twice as heavy with bullets, suffer even more here and will have a substantially bigger Evo Ergo penalty than what the tooltip will have you believe. If you don't have enough ergo on a gun, this means that you can end up going into negative Evo Ergo territory with a 60-rounder way easier than you'd think, especially for a suppressed and or heavy weapon. And going into negative Evo Ergo is what creates overswing, which is something you really don't want to play with, which means your weapon will swing past your point of aim before swinging back to center when you ADS, which introduces essentially a small delay before you can accurately aim. I've tried to keep all of the weapons in this video above overswing territory wherever possible, which means that some of the weapons might technically have access to better recoil, for example, but at the cost of overswing. What's especially interesting is how ergonomics scale non-linearly. So if your total ergo is very low, or 0, then adding 1 or 2 points of ergo won't really change anything, because weight is the deciding factor. But once your ergo is a bit higher, say around 50 or 60, each additional point has a much bigger impact. And at high enough ergo, you can actually start outscaling the penalty from even a very heavy gun. And this is why the SAG AKs, for example, even though they are very heavy guns, where a meta SAG will be roughly 6 kilograms, which is 2 kilos or 50% heavier than a meta M4, they still retain a lot of Evo Ergo because you can get their ergonomics so high. So in short, the lower your ergonomics, the more weight matters, and the higher your ergonomics, the less weight matters. And that's a big deal to know when you're trying to get a balanced meta build with both low recoil and good ergo. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, looking at the results of Evo Ergo, here we can actually see the effect of high ergo on the impact of weight by looking at the AK-103, that even being almost 1 kilogram heavier than the MCX at the top, and has only 1 ergo more than the MCX, it barely falls behind. Loud weapons obviously perform the best, as suppressors is usually going to be a significant ergo penalty, and due to weight, an even bigger Evo Ergo penalty. The Velociraptor is the best suppressed here, despite it not actually having a foregrip. Its base ergo is fairly high, and it's barely over 4 kilograms. While the suppressed M4 is performing well here, the loud M4 is beaten out by a lot more weapons. The SR3M, the VAL, and the M4 are all sitting fairly high amongst the suppressed weapons. The 9A91 is performing well, as well as the suppressed AKS-74U. There is also a decent spread between the calibers here. There is no real dominant caliber. Even 7.62 is taking 5th and 7th place, and 545 is making a lot of the top placements. We can also see the massive impact of a 60-rounder on Evo Ergo. If we take a look at the RD704, which is a high ergonomics weapon at a ergo of 78, it goes from having 68.3 Evo Ergo and a 0.46 second ADS time with a 30-rounder to having 27.3 in Evo Ergo and a 0.59 second ADS time when using a 60-rounder, meaning a 60-rounder takes the gun halfway to overswing territory and adds 130 milliseconds to the ADS time, and that's for a meta high ergonomics weapon. So 60 rounders are very punishing to Evo Ergo, but obviously they come with a massive advantage of having twice as many bullets. While Evo Ergo is a good measure of a weapon's actual ergonomics, we are actually not going to be directly using Evo Ergo in handling, simply because of how it scales and that it can sort of inflate the results a little bit and make it hard to measure the real relative performance of the weapons. So instead we are using the ADS time in the handling stat. The ADS time is based on DB for Tarkov's feature, which is in beta, so pinch of salt, but it seems accurate for the handful of guns I tested it with. And there is no real difference in ranking for Evo Ergo or ADS time between the weapons, meaning that ADS time is very directly derived from Evo Ergo. And since there is no way I'm aware of that you can increase ADS time and lower other things affected by Ergo like stamina drain while aiming, I think it's safe to use ADS time as a representative for Ergo in this case. ADS time is also directly relevant to the scenario that handling is supposed to evaluate. With ADS time giving us an idea of how snappy a weapon is, and IBC telling us how controllable it is in a burst, the handling stat I think gives a good idea of how a gun feels to use. High handling weapons feel quick and responsive, you can snap to target and stay on target, and low handling guns feel heavy, sluggish, and hard to control. Now when looking at the handling results, we can see that the 5.56 AKs are doing very well, by merit of having a very good ADS time and also a very good controllability thanks to their moderate fire rates. The M4 is also up there, barely behind the AKs, which are just scraping past the M4 due to their slightly better controllability. Interestingly, the M4 can get away with less ergo, at just 71 ergo for the allowed M4, because it has such a light weight. So even though in a meta state it has a lower ergo than the other weapons, it still handles very well and is competitive thanks to its light weight. I think this stat gives a very good idea of a weapon's ease of use if you want. I think a lot of people will find the best handling weapons on this list to also be the most user-friendly. The 9x39s are doing well, the SR3M, even being suppressed, is actually beating a lot of the loud weapons, with the Val not very far behind. But what about a weapon's ability to drop a target, its damage output? Now the obvious way to show this is through DPS, or damage per second, but this is often a fairly inaccurate stat in my experience, as a lot of community tools and resources are just going to look at flesh damage times fire rate, there's your DPS. But there are determining factors for how much damage a weapon deals besides flesh damage and fire rates. Mainly the penetration value of the ammunition used in addition to its flesh damage, and also the armor your opponent is wearing, because people usually aren't fighting naked players. I instead made a couple of different stats. One is similar to the traditional DPS, but it looks at the actual DPS output through armor. Specifically level 5 in this case, as that is the most common armor level that you will meet at this point in the wipe. And this is based on the actual penetration damage from a weapon, its average damage per bullet through armor, while armor has a mitigating effect. And then we couple that with the gun's fire rate per second. And this gives a better idea of the damage output, as you are considering the net damage the bullets are doing when you're fighting armor instead of their flesh damage, which could be very misleading. This also allows a bullet's penetration and the significant impact of armor to play a role. Now, when looking at the DPS through armor results, this category is obviously dominated by some outliers in the ASH-12 and AVT. I wouldn't really seriously consider these guns too much because even though they sit at over 100 DPS more than anything else on the list, they have massive drawbacks in pretty much every other category, killing their overall viability. But if you want pure DPS, they're technically the best. It's also important to know as well that because of how armor, a weapon's fire rate, and chance of kill works, DPS does not have a perfect correlation to a weapon's actual time to kill. If we consider time to kill, which we'll get to next, the spear will actually beat out the ASH-12 even with a lower after armor DPS. The SIG Spear with Hybrid is the winner here of the other weapons in terms of DPS, though it is very closely followed by the FAL, the SA-58, firing M61. The 308 MDR also slaps here, it's one of the FAL and the MDR's only redeeming qualities, but the 9x39s are also doing very well with SP6. We'll get to this in time to kill as well, but this is why I absolutely love the SR3M and the VAL, even after their overheating nerf, because with SP6, they absolutely chew up armored enemy players. The 5.56 weapons are going to perform fairly middle of the pack here due to M855A1 being fairly mediocre against level 5 armor, but these are weapons with other strong points than DPS as a reason to use them. The losers here are pretty much the AKs in general. The 7.62 AKs will do decent and sit between the fastest firing 5.56 weapons, somewhere in the middle, but 5.45 and 5.56 AKs will be sitting at the bottom of the list, some of them not even scratching 400 after armor DPS, due to the ammo being fairly mid, with M855A1 and 5.45 BP being almost exactly the same bullet and both bad against armor, and their very slow 600 RPM fire rate. The slow 5.56s like the AUG, the 5.56 MDR, and the SCAR L also struggle here, especially the MDR and the SCAR. However, the most useful and enlightening thing to me was when I decided to make a time to kill stat based on cumulative chance of kill from Tarkov Ballistics' very good ballistic simulator, and this timed cumulative chance of kill, which is what we'll call it, is based on how many bullets of a certain caliber and type are needed to achieve a 90% or higher cumulative chance of kill, and then based on the weapon's fire rate, how quickly the gun will be able to fire that amount of bullets. Basically, how quickly can you get to a 90% or higher chance of having killed the target when, in this case, the target is wearing level 5 armor. We can see that for 5.56 M855A1, for example, it will take 5 shots to get to a 90% chance of kill or higher, whereas M61, being a much more powerful round, will only need 2 bullets against level 5 to get to 90%, even though just barely. And this does mean that M61 will way more often than not 2-shot enemies in level 5 armor to the thorax, which is extremely powerful. When looking at the results for this timed cumulative chance of kill, the M61 round, and as a result 308, dominates pure time to kill. 2 shots to kill to thorax is just way too good, and it puts every single 308 weapon ahead of everything else in terms of kill time, with the 308s dropping opponents in 0.1 seconds at the longest and 0.86 seconds at the fastest. Now, the AVT is technically the winner in terms of pure numbers here, but like I said earlier, I don't really take the AVT very seriously. Needing 5 rounds to get to a 90% kill chance is also the main reason the 5.56 and the 5.45 weapons struggle here. Even with the M4 and HK sitting at 800 and 850 RPM respectively, it doesn't anywhere close to make up for the lacking effective damage per bullet. Now, if we use M80 as the 308 round instead, it's actually much more even, but M80 still puts some of the weapons, like the FAL and the 308 MDR, ahead of 5.56 in terms of time to kill. So 308 weapons are currently very good. The only problem for the FAL and the MDR is all the other problems they have, like we talked about earlier. So the overall most viable option for 308, like the SCAR Age or specifically the X17 variant, while using M80, will perform slightly worse thanks to a lower RPM, and it will fall right between the HK and the M4 in terms of time to kill. The main advantage to 308 here is M61 being so available, where 5.56 doesn't really have a good option for ammo better than M855A1. M995 and SSA-AP can't be crafted like M61 can, and is unsustainably rare to find. This is why I'm comparing M61 to M855A1 and 5.45 BP, as they are the best available ammo for each caliber, as they can be crafted, and I will only consider the best craftable or purchasable ammo. Besides the 308s dominating thanks to M61, the 9x39s are also doing very well, as SP6 is a very powerful round as well. Backed by a 900 RPM fire rate, it absolutely destroys, and will usually drop an enemy at just over 0.13 seconds. The SIG Spear is barely behind with 6.8 Hybrid. The main issue with the Spear, and especially the Hybrid ammo, is that it's quest locked behind Lightkeeper, which I think is really stupid. It basically means the gun doesn't see use by 95%, if not more, of the player base. 7.62 also struggles here, and I think this is one of the areas that is making 7.62 so uncompetitive, where it has barely better time to kill with BP than the HK and the M4 does with M855A1, at 0.05 seconds faster, so realistically speaking, the same. And that's coming out of the Mutant as well. If we look at the second tier of ammo, with 7.62 using PP in that case, it's actually a lot more even, and 7.62 weapons with PP only really fall behind M80, while remaining comparable to SPP. So 7.62 PP is arguably, in terms of time to kill, some of the better weapons when punching up against level 5 armor, with tier 2 ammo, compared to BT545 or M856A1 for example, still beaten by M80 though. Again, we can see the power of M80 here, being very accessible, available early, and the best second tier ammo against level 5, and even holding up against level 5 compared to the tier 1 ammo, which just cements 308 further as the winner in terms of damage. Now the problem with M80, even though it has one of the better mid-tier timed cumulative chance of kill, is that it's not so fast that you won't get headshotted by your opponent in the meantime. And this is a disadvantage for M80 against 5.56 M855A1 or 5.45 BP, because it has roughly the same time to kill to torso, but 308 guns are usually lower fire rate and harder to control, meaning they are less suited for landing headshots than the 5.56 or 5.45 rifles. M61, on the other hand, drops a target a whole 0.2 seconds or 200 milliseconds faster than that same gun shooting M80. And this is what allows M61 being shot center mass to effectively compete with headshots in terms of how quickly you can kill a target. Because if you just have to hit a torso to kill in 0.1 seconds, a tenth of a second, with M61, while your opponent using an M4, for example, has to specifically hit your head to kill you faster than that, then you have a massive advantage in that scenario. This again shows us very clearly why M61 is such a monster round and why it's frankly a bit too accessible for how powerful it is. Because even with it being fired from the lower range of weapons in terms of fire rate, it still has the fastest time to kill in the game against level 5 Thorax, easily. Obviously, if reaction time was theoretically the exact same and your enemy was as accurate with his first shot to your head as you were with your 2 shots to his torso, then obviously he would win. But to have barely any penalty in terms of time to kill for going for center mass over a headshot is very significant, because you can way more reliably hit center mass than a headshot. Now, headshots do sort of bypass this stat, as obviously headshots are mostly one-shot kills unless you are using the completely wrong ammo or you get very unlucky with ricochets, for example. So if you're going for headshots, the most important thing to look at is the hit consistency, which I mentioned earlier, which might as well be called headshot consistency. I also got thinking about a situation I more and more have started evaluating weapons on when it comes to fighting at range. And this is a weapon's ability to quickly aim and accurately fire a shot at the target. Now, I just decided to call this accurate shot to target ability, and this stat is based on a weapon's ADS speed, its bullet velocity, and its MOA. And it tries to combine all of these to give a good idea of a gun's performance at different ranges. The ADS is weighed the most at the closest ranges because obviously velocity and MOA won't affect a firefight at 25 meters too much, but bullet velocity and MOA instead scale linearly over distance and will naturally be weighed heavier the further the distance. This is quite useful because if a gun can't be accurate at 100 meters, let's say, its ADS speed isn't really that important. So how effectively can a weapon quickly and accurately get a bullet on target? That's what we're looking for here. And it became very noticeable after I started using the DMRs and the semi-automatic rifles in the game more. So it's mainly something I made for those weapons, so it's going to be interesting when we get to those in the next video. But I thought it was worth bringing along for the automatic rifles as well, as there is a few interesting insights I think it gives us. The loud M4 is solidly number 1 at pretty much 75 meters and above, beaten out by the fast ADS high ergo weapons at the 50 and 25 meter ranges. The M4, both loud and suppressed, has the by far best MOA of all the automatic rifles, as well as one of the highest muzzle velocities, which makes it very competent at long ranges. The suppressed M4 is also by far the best suppressed weapon due to, along with the good MOA and velocity, it also maintains a very good Evo Ergo, and by extension a good ADS time despite being suppressed. The 50 meter range and below is really dominated by fast ADS weapons, which makes sense. High ergo is going to be more valuable in those cases than MOA or velocity. It's also interesting how quickly the 7.62 AKs like the loud RD704, the AK103 and AK104 falls off here, being fairly competitive at shorter ranges. But by 75 meters, they're really starting to suffer from their 2+ MOA and mainly their low 7.62 muzzle velocity. The SIG Spear sort of peaks at 9th overall at 100 meters, despite its very good MOA at 1.39. It has a competitive but not the fastest ADS for close range, and it struggles at the very long ranges due to its 800 meters a second muzzle velocity. At 100 meters, the M4 and also the HK actually starts just pulling ahead. The HK with its good MOA and almost 900 meters a second muzzle velocity, thanks to its 20-inch barrel, The AKs are also keeping up. In close ranges, the 5.56 and 5.45 AKs do well, mostly due to their decent ergo and ADS time, with the AK-12 being the best of them at the longer ranges, with the 5.56 AKs following close. The AK-12 mainly keeps up due to a not terrible MOA and barely better muzzle velocity than the M4, but the 5.56 AKs are keeping up mainly due to their 945 meters a second velocity, around 50 meters a second faster than the M4, as their MOA isn't really helping them. At 200 meters, the M4 and the HK are basically just starting to gap pretty much everything else. Now, if we just consider MOA and velocity as a sort of measure of accuracy, then we can see that the M4 and the HK dominates, followed by the AUG, and then we start getting to the rest. Now, it's important to note that this is with the HK using a 20-inch barrel, and a 20-inch barrel will help both muzzle velocity and MOA quite substantially. The M4 is using the 16-inch Handsome barrel, which is meta, and while a 16-inch barrel is not a niche fit, the 20-inch I would argue is. It just happens to be meta to run a 20-inch barrel on the HK due to the best handguard, the Crux, only being usable with a 20-inch barrel, and you would arguably not be using a 20-inch if that wasn't the case. It's interesting to see how extremely good the M4 is at range and how far ahead of every other automatic rifle it basically is in terms of accuracy, besides the 20-inch barreled HK. And it's pretty much ahead at 75 meters and out in accurate shot to target. So you have an automatic rifle that can also, with the click of a button, become one of the fastest and most accurate semi-automatic rifles in the game. It is also more accurate than most of the DMRs in the game, only falling behind overall in terms of per shot damage output and kill ability due to being 5.56. But this very much makes the M4 strong and capable at all ranges. Now, in trying to find a overall best, there are tons of different things here that we could consider. I also want to score the weapons with a normalized scoring system, so weapons are going to be scored based on how they are performing relative to the best and worst in that given category, which I think gives us the most fair comparison. We want to include an even spread from the different categories. So from recoil, we have CFC, or continuous fire controllability. We have hit consistency, which measures recoil and fire rate. We have handling, because it considers IBC, or initial burst controllability, in addition to ADS time. And we are also going to include predictability. Now, the reason for including predictability is that we have so many categories that rewards the low recoil of these smaller caliber weapons, like the 5.56s, and this leads to an overall stat that is fairly punishing of higher caliber weapons. So I think it is fair to include the one recoil category where higher caliber weapons actually excel, which is the fact that they, generally speaking, have a more predictable recoil pattern, which partly mitigates the negatives of their higher recoil, because you can learn and adjust to higher recoil in general, even though, yes, more recoil is still more recoil and therefore inherently harder to control, but it is at the very least made a bit easier due to the predictability of the higher caliber, higher recoil weapons. However, we are going to weigh it only by half to reflect its impact, as it obviously shouldn't count for as much as CFC does, for example, but it still allows us to counter low vertical recoil and prevent it from deciding too much. For Ergo, we are including handling, like I already mentioned, which looks at IBC and uses ADS time as a representative of Ergo, and we are also including Evo Ergo itself. For damage, it's DPS and time to kill, both with tier 1 PvP ammo, so M855A1, BP M61, and also time to kill with tier 2 PvP ammo, so M856A1, BT, PP, M80, etc. And we are also going to include accuracy. We're not going to include accurate shot to target though, simply because of how much it kind of distorts the scores, and to be fair, it's not really relevant past 50 or maybe 75 meters for most engagements, and it's already sort of taken care of through accuracy and Evo Ergo. Also including too many categories, and we'll start double dipping in certain stats too much, which would create an unfair advantage for weapons that are very strong in one niche area. To no one's surprise, the M4 is the best gun, hands down, beating out everything else as both loud and suppressed. It just performs very well in every single category, even though it doesn't actually place number 1 in any category besides accuracy, both of the ones included in the overall and all the other categories as well. There is just nothing the M4 does really poorly. It's really good recoil and handling wise. It is actually just behind the SR3M and VAL in terms of hit consistency. It does come out ahead in accurate shot to target at 75 meters and out, even though we're not really considering that. Its worst area is time to kill against armor. It has a pretty terrible time to kill, but with the M4, it's so strong when going for headshots that sort of bypasses time to kill against armor as being a major problem, if you have the skill and aim to take advantage of that. And it says a bit about how strong the M4 is in any situation where time to kill isn't very important, because even placing amongst the worst in time to kill, it still gaps everything else overall. I've always felt like the spear is one of the best weapons in the game, assuming you have hybrid ammo, and this is actually quite well reflected in the results here as well. It is also one of the fastest time to kill guns in the game, and the suppressed spear is apparently the second best suppressed rifle in the game. The reason I think the loud spear isn't higher is just that it doesn't have any good choices for muzzle devices. It doesn't actually have any choices at all, and therefore it has a fairly punishing recoil that you cannot really mitigate besides using a suppressor. The X17 also surprised me a little bit due to having quite a lot more mediocre results in specific categories, but it does perform decent enough in most areas and is the overall best 308. Couple that with the insane time to kill and damage output from 308 M61, and it manages to place very high on this list. The suppressed X17 does take a hit thanks to the suppressor in areas where it's already just middle of the pack, and therefore while having the same kill potential as the loud X17, it does fall a lot lower amongst the suppressed weapons. The suppressed X17 does end up a lot lower on the list than the loud, and this might be due to the X17 loud having a longer barrel, a 20-inch barrel, as the Ergo is there for it, while the suppressed would go into overswing as a result of using a 20-inch barrel. So a X17 suppressed with a longer barrel would potentially be way closer to the loud X17. What's interesting though is that the gap between the Scar Age suppressed and loud is also huge, and both of those use a 16-inch barrel. So it's not just happening with the X17 due to the barrel, likely it is also due to their weight and ergo problems, as they suffer a lot from adding suppressors, both the Scar Age and the X17 variant. The SR3M with the VAL and VSS not much further down the list are very strong weapons, but with a few major disadvantages. Their poor accuracy thanks to a very low subsonic muzzle velocity and their really high MOA, the fact that they are limited to having 30 rounders as their biggest magazine size, and also the horrible overheating mechanic that has in many ways ruined the viability of these guns. Because besides these faults, they are absolute monsters with low time to kill, very good controllability in recoil, and snappy handling. The HK, while not at the very top, it is still solid, both loud and suppressed. The AK-101 and 102 are the highest of the AKs. Funnily, it's the 5.56 AKs, but I think this is accurate. They are good guns, although they, along with the 5.45 AKs, have the biggest time to kill problem of all the guns. The RD704 places the best of the 7.62s, placing 11th. It has great predictability thanks to its low horizontal recoil and therefore also decent continuous fire controllability despite its larger caliber. It has very good ergo, so even when suppressed it doesn't suffer too much of an Evo Ergo penalty, and it's fairly consistently the best 7.62 besides in damage and time to kill, where the Mutant barely beats it. The Mutant though really surprised me at 32nd place for the loud Mutant. Overall, it just doesn't perform very well. It has better MOA than the RD704, but it has worse recoil than the RD, substantially worse ergo, so even though it's slightly lighter, it has almost half the Evo Ergo, meaning the suppressed Mutant really suffers. The only place the MK47 Mutant is really better is in terms of DPS and time to kill. The problem is that 50 RPM advantage in fire rate over the RD704 only makes up a 0.023 second difference in time to kill to level 5 Thorax. The 7.62s overall do struggle a lot in Tarkov, not really excelling at any specific thing. Despite the bigger caliber, they have only a marginally better time to kill than 5.56 or 5.45, while being behind 5.56 and 5.45 in every way when it comes to recoil and handling. The AK-12 places the best of the 5.45s with the RPK right behind, surprisingly. The AK-12 should really be better in my opinion. It lacks a lot of modability, it has no real handguard options or muscle device alternatives. Also in raw stats, it's just not that impressive. I really wish the AK-12 could have been a competitor to the M4 in terms of being the best gun in the game. The 545s also struggle compared to 556 in general here, overall. This is mainly likely due to just not having the same high fire rate available on any of the platforms. The AK-12 at 700 RPM is beating the rest as a result of this. The 308s in general are getting very varied placings, likely due to having such a broad span in Ergo available, where the X17 is competitive on Ergo, the SA58 for example really struggles. The losers are easily the ASH-12 and the ABT-40 when looking at the overall placements. Now it is important to keep in mind here that, just like I said at the start of the video, it is extremely difficult to give a overall best weapon, as that isn't really a thing in Tarkov. Everyone has different playstyles and preferences, and will find certain categories more important and relevant to how they play the game. Also keep in mind that the gap in performance is not as big as the list makes it seem. Most weapons in Tarkov are perfectly viable if you know how to use them and play to their strengths, and hopefully this video has helped you gain some idea of what guns are good in what situations and the different strengths and weaknesses of the various guns in the game. Let me know your thoughts down below. What do you think about the results in this video? Do you have some constructive criticism, something I could do better for the next category of weapons, which will likely be the semi-automatic rifles and DMRs? Then let me know that as well. Do these results reflect your own experience with Tarkov's guns, or do they not? Let me know down below. I'm curious to hear. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.